Hello, I am Jolie Long with the National Board for Certified Counselors. We welcome you to our webinar today. NBCC offers free live webinars on current and emerging topics of interest in the counseling profession. We value and welcome all practitioners, students, professors, and anyone working in the profession. Next. Before we begin, I would like to share some meeting details. Closed captions are now enabled, and attendees can turn these on and off as desired. Interpreters can join the meeting via the phone number, ID, and passcode provided on this slide. A link to this PowerPoint presentation will be posted in the chat so you can access the links on the slide. To receive continuing education credit, you must complete the session evaluation, including an attendance attestation. The link to the evaluation will be posted in the chat at the conclusion of the webinar. We will also send you an email with a link to the evaluation following the webinar. We will only be providing continuing education credit for live attendance. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the NBCC website for viewing purposes only. Due to the large number of attendees, the participants will remain in listen-only mode throughout the meeting. The presenters will be taking questions at the end of the session, so please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Next. Today's webinar is titled Impacts of Client Change on Your Clients and Your Practice, a Roadmap to Resilience. First up, we welcome Dr. Debbie Sturm and Dr. Ryan Reese to talk about climate change, mental health, and the counseling profession. They will be followed by Mr. Brian Banks, who will talk about NBCC's new Policy, Advocacy, and Research and Counseling Center. We will cover all of the learning objectives that are listed on this slide. Next. I would now like to introduce our speakers, and their full bios are in the slides for your convenience. Dr. Ryan Reese is an associate professor of counseling at Oregon State University and is a leading international expert in eco-wellness counseling. He developed the eco-wellness framework and its associated assessment tool, the EcoWellness-Inventor. Recognized with the 2023 Gary R. Walls Trailblazer Award from the American Counseling Association, Dr. Reese has championed initiatives on climate change and environmental justice within the field of counselor education. He co-chairs the Association for Counselor Education and Supervision Climate Change Task Force, promoting environmental and climate justice within counselor training. Next. Dr. Debbie Sturm is a 2008 graduate of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte's Counselor Education Program, a professor with James Madison University's PhD in Counseling and Supervision Program, and a counselor with Anchor Counseling Services in Mentor, Ohio. She has nearly 20 years' experience working with children, youth, adults, and families. Her clinical specialties include trauma, grief and loss, anxiety, and family issues. She was a member of ACA's Climate Crisis Task Force and past chair of the Human Rights Committee. Dr. Sturm has been involved in developing climate change, environmental justice, and mental health curriculum competencies for integration into counselor training programs through WASIS and ACES. Next. Brian Banks is the Chief Government Affairs Officer for the National Board for Certified Counselors and the inaugural Executive Director of the Policy, Advocacy, and Research and Counseling Center. He has over 20 years of government affairs experience, during which he has worked for non-governmental organizations, the U.S. Air Force, and Congress. His work has focused on issues including healthcare, education, tax policy, and healthy food access, and the environment. He holds a bachelor's degree in communication studies and a master's degree in politics with a focus on congressional studies from the Catholic University of America. He previously served as Chief of Government Affairs and Public Policy Officer for the American Counseling Association. Since joining NBCC, Banks has been named a 2024 top lobbyist by the National Institute for Lobbying and Ethics. Next, I would now like to welcome Dr. Sturm and Reese to begin their presentation.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. Dr. Sturm and I are just very thrilled to be able to have such a big attendance and to be invited by NBCC to be able to share our work over the past decade or so. Um, and um, uh, and we don't have a lot of time to do it. But welcome. And so what you'll hear us say throughout all of today is that there's so much more to say here. And so we're going to hit a lot of these points, or most of these points, at a 10,000-foot view, if not higher. And so really want to encourage you down this path. Next. So here's our focus for today. Dr. Sturm is going to lead us off and an overview of the climate crisis, and specifically getting in and talking about mental health and climate change, and then moving in and talking about the specific effects of climate change, mental health, and vulnerable populations. Really, we're hoping to spend most of our time today discussing climate-aware counseling practices. So we'll be talking about the eco-wellness counseling framework, and specifically assessment strategies to be addressing the human-nature connection in counseling to promote wellness and resilience, and also address climate change. But then moving through the ACA advocacy competencies, and talking about client empowerment strategies, as well as systems and community advocacy. And then Brian will be touching on climate policy action through PARC. Next, and then Debbie will take it away.
Thank you so much. And I echo what Dr. Reese just shared. We're so excited that you're here. And I hope that at the end of the day, you really are moderately overwhelmed in a good way, in a way that gets you curious, that wants you to connect more to what we're talking about, that wants you to dig in deeper and really join us in helping support counseling interventions, counselor preparation, serving clients and communities. So we're excited you're here, and I hope you are so curious when we're finished. So I'm going to give you an overview about the climate crisis itself and the intersection with mental health. Next. I found this quote a few weeks ago, and I think it really says a lot. Climate change will manifest as a series of disasters viewed through the phones with footage that gets closer and closer to where you live until you're the one filming it. And I invite you to consider climate change, in the respect that we often think of disasters. I want you to sort of broaden your scope for a little bit and realize that we are all living in a changing climate. This could be anything from the disasters that we see so closely and so frequently to things like changing places, changing growing seasons, difficulty in inhabiting places, losing of heritage, land, place, and story. So we're all experiencing some degree of it, and depending on where we live, it's going to look different. So just keep your mind broad, but also recognize that very much in our forefront right now are some of the really intense disasters that have been so present for so many of our communities, and I imagine many of your communities, of those of you who are joining us today. Next, please. Okay, so just some basics to know about the climate crisis. The first one is we're experiencing long-term change in the average weather patterns, which really impact the entire space that we inhabit. And this is all throughout the globe. And one thing to kind of keep in mind is that while this is global, it is also uniquely local. And while this is shared, it's also incredibly personal. So we sort of hold both at the same time. We also recognize that this is moving very quickly. The planet is undergoing rapid changes. We see things in sort of disasters at this time where the increase in frequency, intensity, and duration is beyond what we expected, and is also happening much quicker than was predicted. We also recognize the health impacts, which include just any current existing health consequences that individuals and communities experience are exacerbated by the conditions that are brought on by climate change. And then why does this matter to us? Counselors' understanding of the climate crisis and its impact on clients, communities, and themselves is essential to weathering what's next. It's essential to preparing our communities for what we're experiencing, and it's essential to making sure we respond in a way that helps everybody recover to the extent that's possible and bringing communities close together. We have such a trauma-informed and resilience-oriented lens, and so this really is a place where we can make a great difference. Next, please. And I share this just as a reminder that no matter where you live, there's something that is unique to your area that we are all experiencing. And again, it might not be the disasters that we see so prominently. It may be things like loss of habitat, loss of growing seasons, challenges to your economic well-being, things that might not be as obvious, but are definitely impacting your clients and communities. Next, please. I also want to add, and I think we all just are so aware that climate change is not the only crisis that we're experiencing. This is probably one of my favorite quotes, and I think because it chokes me up every single time I read it. Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap. I ran my fingers across the whole world and whispered, "Where does it hurt?" It answered, "Everywhere." See, I get choked up every time. Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. So we recognize that we're living in a time of real challenges around the climate crisis, and we have a lot of challenges all around that intersect. Next, please. So I'm going to give you a quick orientation to climate change and mental health, and this comes from the areas of climate-related disasters and how they impact us, the impact of environmental degradation on our well-being, the loss of place, livelihood, safety, and security, and how that impacts our sense of security and well-being, concerns over the future, the anxiety around where to live, around whether to have families, about the well-being of your grandchildren and future generations, and then climate anxiety, distress, and grief over the rate at which things are changing and the sort of lack of solutions that seem to be in place. There's a lot of helplessness and frustration there. Next, please. Mental health impacts include depression, anxiety, PTSD, pre-traumatic stress, as well as post-traumatic stress, eco-grief, irritability, as you can imagine, and an intersection with health impact. Recent reports show that climate-related illnesses is threatening individual mental health. So anything that we feel physically, we're also feeling psychologically. And then there's also the concern about the possibility of creating generational trauma. What are we passing on to the next generation? Are we harming them? Are we helping them? Are we advocating for them? Next, please. And a couple more things, as we mentioned, we're going to give you everything really quickly and allow you to digest it at your own pace. But climate impacts our mental health in a direct way. So, for example, if you've been impacted by a disaster, a fire, a hurricane, or some longer-term chronic events like rising temperatures, or perhaps a combination of both, or indirectly by just the general awareness of the social, political, and economic determinants of health and the impacts on poverty, unemployment, and housing. So just seeing what's happening can have an indirect, powerful effect on your well-being. We also have sort of a spectrum of exposure from high to low, but both of which, or I would say all of which on the spectrum, impact us in a different way. So everybody has sort of their unique exposure to the impact on their mental health. Next, please. And how do we experience this? In 3 different ways. It's the mental health impact of hearing about, examining, or being realistic. So it's just the impact of like knowing about climate change. The mental health issues that are exacerbated by the outcomes of climate change, such as heat, drought, and displacement. So existing mental health issues that are exacerbated. And then finally, mental health issues that are directly caused by the impact of climate-related events. Next, please. And just a couple reminders that our most vulnerable neighbors are still our most vulnerable neighbors when it comes to climate change. I love this. This is probably our favorite slide. I think we bring it up all the time because it really captures that climate change is a threat multiplier and a trauma magnifier, with vulnerable communities often being the first and worst hurt. This is a social justice issue. It's a community issue. Next, please. And I love this too. We will be in the same storm, but in very, very different boats. BIPOC and impoverished communities face ongoing forms of racism and psychological traumas, and will also feel the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Given our counseling profession's orientation towards social justice, this is a really important place for us to kind of stake our social justice claim and be able to do some good work. All right. Next, please. And finally, we'll just note that children are impacted differently as well. They have a different generational perspective, and they're probably one of the most vulnerable populations. And they're growing up in a time where climate crisis, along with so many other social issues, are such a stark reality for them and for their future. And next slide. 80% of children feel betrayed by the current generations who haven't protected their future. There's a high degree of sadness, fear, distress, anxiety, shame, depression, grief, and hurt, and a fear that humanity is doomed. So we really want to be attentive to the needs of our children. Okay, Ryan.
Okay, next, Dr. Sturm, thank you so much. So crisis, right? An emergency. This is, we have a lot going on, and we're all experiencing climate change in these direct and indirect ways. And so what is our counseling profession doing about it? The thing is we've all developed within industrialized culture. Our profession, our helping professions developed within an industrialized culture. And within that, there is a disconnection that is inherent within the profession, within the professions broadly speaking. And so, you know, the counseling profession, one that is rooted in social justice, as Debbie shared, holistic wellness, human development across the lifespan, like with the focus on community-based prevention and intervention, like pretty slow to address the human nature connection. Really, not really until kind of 2010 did that really start developing. You know, certainly wilderness therapy has been around for a long time, the ecotherapies, but as far as addressing the human nature connection in our wellness models, it's taken a bit of time. And so similarly, same with climate change. And part of it is it's hard because as a culture, we in Western culture or mainstream culture or industrialized culture, we don't have a broad emphasis on being in deep connection or harmony with the natural world. Next slide, please. And so what have we been doing as a profession or as a field? You know, Dr. Sturm has been at the forefront of this for about a decade now. She has been leading the way. I'm not going to go through and kind of read every single one of these bullet points, but it has been a climb upward for Dr. Sturm, for myself, and for others. To count the number of rejections that we've had from peer-reviewed outlets, whether that's in the form of conferences or journals, like it's been a lot of advocacy. We've been doing a lot of work around this, and we're so encouraged because really in the past 5, 6, 7 years, the profession and professions are really starting to listen more. We're here today because NBCC invited us to be here, which is just wonderful. Like, this is fantastic. ACES, so the Association for Counselor Education and Supervision, they invited Debbie and I to co-chair a task force where we are working with others to develop competencies for counselor preparation on climate change and mental health. So like, this is lovely. This is wonderful. And it's great to have a captive audience here today to be able to say, all right, let's keep this moving. Let's keep this moving forward. Speaking of which, next slide, please. Okay, so our focus today, our primary focus is on climate-aware counseling practices. I'm hoping to only briefly touch on the eco-wellness counseling framework because that framework gets much more broadly at the human nature connection, or I like to say kind of the more than human connection, to really take into consideration a broad way that clients and their communities will be defining nature, but really moving into developing practices, counseling practices through the ACA advocacy competencies. So that's where Debbie will come back on again in a little bit to talk about the various tiers of those competencies in the form of client empowerment, client advocacy, systems advocacy, community engagement, and then legislative and policy advocacy. But let's first talk a bit about eco-wellness. And again, I'll really try to not be too verbose on this topic. But next slide, please. Okay, so what is eco-wellness? So I was fortunate to develop the eco-wellness framework back in the 2010s. And I did that because it wasn't mentioned in our wellness models, our holistic wellness models, which are lovely and really highly evidence-based. So that would be the wheel of wellness and the indivisible self model of wellness. There was no mention of nature or kind of more than human world within these frameworks. And yet there's this giant body of literature outside of the counseling professions for decades now that says, whoa, this impacts nearly every single aspect of human health and wellness. So we ought to be at least asking about this with clients. It's not that we're taking clients outdoors. Certainly, sure, maybe that's your specialty and expertise. So the development of eco-wellness was not a mandate to say we should be taking clients outdoors. It's more like we should be asking clients about their connection with the more than human world and how they define that for themselves and for their communities, because this is critical and integral to our mental health and our wellness. So what you see here is one of the first iterations of the eco-wellness framework, and it just so happens to be my favorite one. I really like this one. So there's 7 different facets to it. I'm not going to go into detail about every single one of these right now in this moment, but I'll at least mention their names. So physical access, sensory access, connection, protection, which I like to think is nature self-efficacy. I wish I would have called it that. Preservation, which is environmental agency, spirituality, and community connectedness. So we're gonna go through and talk a bit about a tiered approach to asking clients at the intake assessment about their connection with the broader world, which includes climate change. Next slide, please. So here's this tiered eco-wellness assessment. And today we're not going to be talking about tier 3 formal assessment. So that's where you would actually administer what's called the eco-wellness inventory. And we're not going to go that far today. Rather, we're going to talk about tier 1 and then tier 2 assessment. Tier 1 is foundational, 100% of clients just asking a couple of questions about their connection with the more than human world. Tier 2 is when you'd be going within a little bit more depth using these 7 different factors as a foundation. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I'm going to say here with the coming 7 or 8 slides or so, which I'll go through pretty quickly, is this is template language. You're going to read this and be like, oh my gosh, like this has this is not relevant to the communities I serve or my style or my approach. Please feel empowered to shift this language. Use this language if it's relevant, but make sure we're shifting our language depending on specialty, depending on the population or populations with whom you're working. But I like to include in the intake assessment process a couple of questions. I get curious about how people are defining nature. To what degree have folks experienced positive experiences with the natural world to where it's contributed positively to their overall wellness and or their resiliency? Also, to what degree have clients experienced adverse experiences and or just a general sense of I don't belong in nature, like that's not something that my community does. Maybe there's intergenerational trauma around nature. And so this question or these questions, we're coming at this from a really open way, not making assumptions about our clients and having positive or adverse experiences with the natural world, but this really opens things up. This also invites us, this framework and approach invites us to really hone in and center in on client language. So here, I'm not just jumping in and asking clients about climate change, right? We live in a really divisive culture right now relative to climate change. Like just using the terminology around climate change can contribute to a political sort of argument and conversation around it. So we want to get really specific around a client's experiences in and around natural environments and getting to know their connection with it, both as a way to identify resiliency and to help establish and foster resiliency within the treatment planning process, but also to identify potential opportunities to be able to engage with clients in conversation around climate change and environmental justice. Next slide, please. So from there, so let's say a client or a family with whom you're working, they say, yeah, we've had some pleasant, unpleasant, and also to what degree would you want to be addressing, the eco-wellness and counseling, or maybe it is more climate change specific. That's when we then more hone in on an informal, I guess, interview sort of process with folks and getting to know their nature connection a little bit more in depth and in detail, again, based on these 7 different factors of eco-wellness. So we'll go through those now pretty briefly. Next slide. So kind of this first area is exploring with clients, what is your connection with the natural world? And again, you're going to see template language here. So um, please modify the language. And I like to get to know folks, both their affective or emotional, their cognitive, and then also thinking about lineage, thinking about ancestral connections, intergenerational connections, maybe intergenerational connections that are now lost, that aren't there anymore on account of oppression and or displacement. But this is a place, an entry point that I think is quite important to be asking clients about. And this is where we'll pretty quickly hear about connection with nature and or fears of loss, and hearing about experiences where people, where sacred places have been lost, and or in the immediate experience of, well, yeah, I just lost my home to a wildfire, right? And so again, that's where we're adjusting this language based on clients. But connection is a primary point here. Next slide, please. Connected with this idea of connection is asking about physical access and sensory access to nature. And I think what's important to be asking about here and considering is that everyone's access is going to look quite different. My access to nature positioned here in Bend, Oregon is going to be quite different than what somebody's access is going to look like in Chicago, Illinois, let alone just based where you are in Chicago, Illinois, right? Like whether you're in Chicago and what part of Chicago you're in, or whether you're in the suburbs and kind of further moving out. But the idea here is we're asking about what level of access do you have, and to what degree is that relevant to your wellness? In the absence of physical access or proximity, sensory access. So asking folks about their sensory experiences and or preferences, such as nature aromas, nature sounds, having visual elements of nature. And importantly, asking about safe access to nature, whether they're nearby parks, and also transportation access. And then this also moves into the realm of environmental justice and asking about, do you have safe drinking water? Do you have food? How close is the nearest store to you? So connection to fruits and vegetables, and being able to have access to the means to get those. Next slide, please. So protection or nature self-efficacy, again, is what I wish I would have called this in the original conceptualization. I think about nature self-efficacy as, to what degree does a client feel like they feel safe and confident to be able to navigate what they would consider to be nature or engage with nature? And this is a place I've seen in my clinical practice as being quite helpful in instilling greater connectedness to nature and also resiliency. In the form of developing broader connectedness, broader access to nature, and being able to experience all these positive effects of the natural environment. Again, that's where we go back to issues of access, which is a bit beyond the scope of our immediate conversation. But as far as bolstering resilience, this is a really important area to be able to address with clients and also problem solve around with clients. Next slide. Spirituality. This is one of kind of the biggest, people are like, oh yeah, no duh. I mean, nature, natural environment, it can really inspire a sense of kinship, spirituality with nature. But this is also one I'll emphasize here for folks who have experienced direct loss relative to climate change, wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, intensified storms that have contributed to loss of important and sacred places. And so being able to ask about this and proactively asking about spiritual connection to place, I think is really critical with many of our clients. And again, using that through the framing of the client's language. Next slide, please. Community connectedness. I think this is another critical one. And this also gets back to sort of this which Debbie will be talking about in terms of preparation, proactively engaging with community, and in what ways have folks been engaging with community in and around natural environments and or just nearby parks, and also broadening that out further and thinking about the level of preparedness for potential climate issues that may be popping up, the threats of wildfire, for example, and how are communities coming together around this. Debbie will speak more to this community connectedness here in a little bit. Next slide. Okay, last factor here. Thanks for bearing with me, everybody. So you're probably fine, like, all right, finally, you're talking about environmental agency. We're here to talk about climate change. But this is where we're asking folks about what are their individual or collective actions that they're engaging with to feel like they have a sense of agency and that they can do something to proactively address, whether we're calling it preservation, proactively addressing climate change, mitigating, whatever language we want to use or whatever language our clients are using, really getting at that to where we can help empower clients to take action that is immediately relevant to cultural and lived context, and also relevant to our identities or the client's identities that they have. So that's what this is really getting at here. Okay, next slide. Okay, so then that comes back to, all right, well, what are we doing again? So to me, this is one slice of the pie. This is just one slice of holistic wellness where we're asking a little bit or maybe a lot with some clients, depending on their preferences and depending on the relevancy of this to the client and their worldview. But this is where we're bringing the pieces together from the broader intake process and identifying interventions that can be embedded in the treatment plan. And so the specific example here with, relative to climate change is, okay, all right, there is maybe the threat of climate change that is very much on the client's mind. Maybe, they haven't been hit yet with the wildfire, but they live in a region or an area that is very susceptible, highly susceptible to to wildfire. And so it's working with them, identifying what are the individual actions that you can take to really instill a sense of autonomy, while also being prepared. What does it look like to connect with your neighbors, with your community? And that leads us into more climate-aware counseling practices with Debbie.
Thanks, Ryan. That was fantastic. Next slide. So what is climate-aware counseling? I think if you Googled this, you would find a lot of different definitions of it. For the purpose of this, we're really anchoring it into being essentially trauma-informed, but within the context of our relationship to our lived environment and the changing environment. And additional to sort of recognizing that our neighbors, our communities, and different people in different places have their own vulnerabilities, we recognize that in addition to climate change, people have a cumulative trauma burden just from their lived experience as it is. And now we're adding the impact of climate change and climate-related issues to that trauma burden that people are carrying. In addition, we recognize that people have both direct and indirect stressors as a result, and that there's individual and community risk and protective factors. So if you're trying to conceptualize what is climate-aware counseling, it builds on what Ryan shared about we are deeply connected to the natural world in our own way. When the natural world hurts or is harmed or is lost, it's a hurt or a harm or a loss to us as well. When we lose our places, when we feel things are under threat, when we're unstable in our own lived space, it really impacts our well-being and it adds to existing vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. So climate-aware counseling is really being aware, I mean, literally aware, that climate change is something that exists in all of our spheres. We all encounter it in some degree. Whether we put the label of climate change to it or not is really a unique individual decision. But many places that might not be experiencing disasters are losing natural spaces. They might have shortened growing period. They might see a threat to livelihood. They might see youth choosing not to remain in their community. They might see things such as insurance prices and housing costs and repair costs and access to goods and foods and services being impacted just by the nature of how our environment is presenting in their particular place. One of the most important things that we can do is sort of know the range of experiences that people may be having, but also know your community. And I think we're going to continue to go back to this throughout this conversation, is know your community well. What are the unique threats to where you live? Who are your most vulnerable neighbors? And what are their multiple vulnerabilities that they're already experiencing? How do the climate-related threats then intersect with those vulnerabilities? And if you're in an area with climate-related disasters, do you have a plan within your practice, within your agency, within your school, within your community to really prepare for, discuss, and really own that there's a sort of a pre-impact phase and impact phase and sort of a post-impact period, an extended recovery, as well as in so many places, we have the reality that a secondary impact is possible, or the aftermath could be really extended in the recovery. So climate-aware counseling is just recognizing that climate change takes many forms. It's uniquely personal, it's uniquely local, and we really want to understand our communities and their vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. And this is just sort of a reminder that when we think about disaster response, we recognize there's sort of a prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery cycle. As you're conceptualizing, like, how do you make a change in your practice or your agency or other organization, we kind of take the same approach to creating a climate-aware counseling practice. We want to think in terms like, how do we have language around prevention or mitigation for our clients to think about, like, what can we do, as Ryan talked about with like that agency, like how can we prepare on the front end? How can we have honest conversations about risk, about vulnerabilities? How do we make sure that we're doing the best we can to communicate clearly, to make sure there are resources available, and to really just sort of have a united front in understanding that we will likely be impacted at some point, and we want to make sure that that's a part of a reality that we prepare for, that we talk about, that we approach with our clients. Next slide. Okay. The next couple of slides, I'm going to just sort of organize around the ACA advocacy competencies. I think they give us just a really nice framework to think about, like an individual or a client related level, a community or school or agency related level, and then more of the broader sort of public arena, public policy, social justice advocacy level. So that's the framework I'm going to follow just to sort of organize our thinking for the next few slides. Next slide. And the first one is sort of counselors and empowering clients. So this is when you're directly working with clients. And I won't read all of these. I'll let you sort of dig into them. But one of them is sort of keep a climate-informed and trauma-informed lens on your work with clients. Recognize people are experiencing all of the above in some capacity, and don't be afraid to approach it or include it in your conversations. Know your own climate and nature worldview. What is your story? How have you been impacted? How is this woven into the work that you do? We always engage in a me search when we're doing our work, and this is an opportunity for you to really sort of know your own story. And it's possible that when we're talking about this with clients or even like internally with ourselves or in supervision, that we recognize that nature sometimes can be traumatizing or could have had a negative experience, or that connection has been difficult. For some people, the impact of disasters can feel like a betrayal. Like, I've been connected to the natural world my whole life, and now my home is gone, and I don't even recognize my community anymore. So there's a lot in our work with clients that can sort of unpack some things. We also can have a role in helping prepare people. Things like go bags. What is your process of communication? How do you recognize threat or distress and be able to take care of yourself and families? Make sure as a counselor you know your resources and how to connect clients to the communities, and develop an eco-wellness-informed assessment and intervention strategies so that we're always having these conversations with our clients as part of their whole being. Next slide. So I'm taking this to like the next level. So once we're sort of working with clients around empowerment and advocacy and awareness, then we're also thinking about how do we create that within our own agencies? I mean, the reality is if your community is impacted by a climate-related disaster, for example, so is your staff, so is your agency, so are your community partners, and so are your clients. And so we want to take a holistic view of the entire system within which we're working and a really community-oriented focus to integrating climate change awareness and coping strategies, as well as just good partnerships so that we can help and support each other throughout this process. So this is very local, relational, and intentional. Next slide. Okay, and some things to consider is how do you grow confidence in talking about clients about disaster preparedness and coping strategies? And also, how do you really create a system within your in-house training or supervision to support and expand climate-informed practices within your agency? So again, we're taking it from the individual to a practice within your agency that you can put in place. How do you adopt trauma-informed approaches to climate-related issues that you talk about with your coworkers, that you incorporate into supervision? Can you add to your agency or practice media and resources items that reflect an awareness of climate change, of eco-anxiety, of disaster fear and distress, of maybe climate cafes where people can come and talk within your agency, support groups or youth support groups within the agency, or in partnership with like your community partners so that you're having a broader outreach. Also consider pathways for active hope, which is when we take action, we always feel a little more hopeful. So what are pathways that your system can engage in to help promote active hope? Okay, next slide. We could talk about this all day, all day. And then how do we engage and empower within our community? One thing that we know is that healing occurs through community and connection. I'm a big fan of relational cultural therapy. I cannot help but keep going back to the idea that connection is where everything lies for healing, for support, for growth. And so consider ways to collaborate with other mental health and overall health providers in your community. Join in local events or campaigns as an agency or a practice or an individual counselor. Use your collective voice to raise awareness on climate emotions and the impact of climate health. Perhaps you can participate as an agency in some of your state and local organizations in order to make sure that mental health is included in climate-related policies. And consider offering, again, support groups, not just for clients, but also for staff in your agency or your practice, and also for community providers like environmental groups, school counselors, health educators, environmental educators. Like, how do we connect to the whole community? Next slide, please. All right. And then again, this is just a reminder that we have a wonderful opportunity through our relatedness to be able to facilitate community connection. And how can you and your practice become a point of connection in that? Again, I'm a big RCT fan. It really says that we grow not through separation, but rather in and toward connection. We need connection just as we need air and water. And I think as Ryan shared, we need connection to our natural world. We need connection to each other. We need connection to our communities. And therefore, when we take the time within our agencies, our communities, and our practices, our schools to foster that, because we know it works and we know it helps our communities, then we can make a huge difference. So hopefully that's one thing you can take away is connect, connect, connect. All right, next slide. All right, and then just a few other things that we'll offer you in the last minute or so of me talking is just consider ways to improve access to mental health services in your community. We know that vulnerable populations are already having a hard time connecting and staying connected. You can do things like ensure that there's a good communication policy within your agency should there be a disruption in care, and you can figure out how to prepare your clients ahead of time for any vulnerabilities that they may experience. Educate clients about the health risks of climate change. We know things like extreme heat, wildfire smoke, and a number of other conditions actually exacerbate other health and mental health conditions. There's been studies that show that the effectiveness of some medications is really hampered during extreme heat. And so things like that are really important to have as part of our practices. And whether it's fact sheets or resources that you have on hand that we can make a normal part of conversation with our clients. Engage in climate-aware training and supervision within your practice, or consult with some of us on the outside who are doing this to say, like, this is how you can bring this into supervision. This is how you can bring this into your training and your CEUs. And really have a comprehensive safety plan for your agency or your practice yourself that includes both pre-impact, impact, and post-impact plans for communication, outreach to clients, particularly vulnerable clients who may lose access to their own resources, and support for staff. I have a friend at an agency who had to take some time off throughout several days because the roofers were at her house. So how do we look out for each other? How do we enable each other throughout the experiences that we have? And be open, transparent, flexible, and responsive, and always connect as a community. Next slide. Ooh, thank you. I think I'm handing over to Brian.
Thank you both very much for this very informative session. You covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time. I know we didn't give you a lot of time, so we really appreciate that. We're so thankful that you could come here and spend some time with us today and educate us on this topic that you both are so clearly passionate about, and how we can be prepared for climate change and what is coming down the road to us. We commend all the work that you both have done and you're continuing to do in this area. And we do have some questions that are coming into the Q&A box. We are going to get to those, or as many as we can, after a brief presentation from our new NBCC PARC Center. So I now invite Brian Banks to come on and share some information with you about PARC.
Hello, everyone. I once again would like to thank our presenters for the expertise that they've shared with you today. We are definitely excited about what is happening in the PARC program, and I assure you we will continue to bring you presentations and resources that counselors and your clients need, whether it's a hot button issue, a trending issue, or just information that you need facts on. Next slide, please. PARC, let me tell you a little bit about the PARC Center. PARC is proactive, engaging, informative, strategic, and PARC will become global. We were birthed in July of 2024, and we are really designed as a resource center for counselors. Our PARC program will support our government affairs program, but at the same time, it will support our counselors and allow us to remain proactive, not only for the profession, but for the legislators, the regulators, the appointed officials, to ensure that they are protecting our profession and providing us the resources and tools that we need. PARC is a research center. Next slide, please. Now, a little bit more about the center. Our center supports counselors' needs from grad school to retirement. We are designed to help you with career expertise. We want to help build leaders in the profession. We are here to create partnerships with our partners at ACES and other organizations, and we want to support the licensure boards with decisions that they need clarity on, as well as, again, appointed officials and government officials. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about our goals. First and foremost, we want to bridge the gap between evidence-based practice and policy. That is extremely important. Over the years, I've noticed that with the profession, we've missed in some cases when it comes to being proactive. And so PARC is going to allow us to gain the expertise, the resources, and tools that counselors and professionals that are protecting the profession need to be proactive and provide legislators informative information so they can make decisions that are guided by expertise from counselors. We are going to make sure that we are ensuring that counselors are heard in their daily lives and explaining what the needs are of the clients in communities across the nation and across the world. And yes, it will be dedicated research by experts, just like we had today, that we will share with you in this platform as well as other platforms as well. In the next 2 or 3 months, you'll see a PARC website, which will allow you to learn more about what we're doing in PARC and the information that we are focused on that we really need to get to you. Within PARC, when I came here a little over 6 months ago, we talked to counselors internal of NBCC, we went external of NBCC, and we talked to legislators and their staffers about what is needed in mental health care, in education, in rehab. The list goes on, and we have an exhaustive list that we went through, and we're prioritizing those areas to focus on to get you the information that you need, as well as legislators and regulators the information that they need so they can make the right decision for the profession. Next slide, please. Now, there have been several key actions that we've taken over the past several months, which you'll see on your screen. I want to tell you this. Within those actions, we have already started research on Medicare reimbursement a year later. What's missing? How can we increase reimbursement? What do our legislators really need to know of how this program is affecting the counselors as well as the clients? That started. We're focused on issues when it comes to suicide, when it comes to the business of counseling. How do you run a counseling business? Those resources are needed. Counselors are asking for it. We're going to bring you those resources. We're meeting with HRSA and SAMHSA, government agencies, CMS, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs on a quarterly basis to ensure that they have the information that they need about counselors and that we have the information that we need so we can get it to you in the most productive manner as possible. Recently, we met with Representative Carrera from California's 46th District to talk about psychedelics. He wanted to know, what can we do to support mental health counselors, school counselors when it comes to psychedelics? And we sat down and had a productive conversation with him. And it was just our first conversation. We're going to continue that conversation with him to ensure that counselors are included in the conversation. And recently, I had an opportunity to speak to Senator Markwayne Mullins' staffer about IHS, the Indian Health Services, and what they need to ensure that they are bringing more counselors into the profession. That conversation will continue. All of these conversations are supported by PARC. PARC allows our government affairs team to be the most robust government affairs team that you will find within the profession because we're being proactive in our approach, along with our partners from our sister organizations. Next slide, please. Now, I'm sure there are questions coming, but before those questions, I want to make sure you know how to reach us. To get to us, you can email us at PARC, P-A-R-C, at nbcc.org. I personally check those emails, so I will respond to you within 24 hours. And y'all can also call us over the phone, 336-547-0607, and we'll be happy to help you. We are working with grad students, we're working with practicing counselors, we're working with counselor educators, and all of the above. So I would say this to you, please continue to stay informed, stay engaged, and until next time, please keep advocating. Thank you, and back to Jolie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian. So appreciated for you to introduce PARC to the folks that don't know about it yet. You're very passionate too about the work of PARC. So we have three experts here that are very passionate about what they're doing. I want to thank Dr. Reese, Dr. Sturm, and Brian for sharing your knowledge and time with us today. And now we're going to move into a question and answer period. We have a few minutes for some questions. We'll entertain as many as we can until we come to the end of our time together. So let's see here. This one is for you, Debbie and Ryan. What is pre-traumatic stress? Someone has written in and said, I love the term pre-traumatic stress, but would like to know a little more about it. Can one of you speak to that, please?
I can probably do that. One way to think about it is sort of like anticipatory stress. When you are, here's an example, when the NOAA reports come out each summer that projects how many hurricanes are going to hit the Gulf region, you're already starting to anticipate the impact of something that could really disrupt your life or do significant damage. So clients may be anticipating something coming their direction, and it's really important to be able to like bring that to the forefront and acknowledge like some of these things we sort of see coming or we fear that it's coming. If there's wildfire smoke in the air, even though you may not be impacted, it still sort of brings up this fear that this could happen to you or in your community. So the pre-traumatic stress is that anticipatory experience and the ways that it impacts you. And I hope that helps.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. All right, let's see here. Here is one. I have a client with persistent and treatment-resistant severe depression. He is consistently distressed about climate change and the demise of our world. How might you approach treatment with him from your framework? And I think that would probably be for Dr. Reese.
I love that question. I don't love that the client is experiencing that. That's really challenging. I, what I do really value about the eco wellness framework is it doesn't prescribe this is what you do. I think it identifies an opportunity or opportunities for a client to be identifying elements of eco wellness that feel relevant to further bolster resiliency, because this and integrated into this broader treatment plan and integrated within your broader theoretical approach. So whether you're coming at things from an ACT, acceptance, commitment, and therapy, IFS, internal family systems, cognitive behavioral therapy, I think that you're able to really bring this in and infuse this modality in a way that makes sense for you as the clinician, and importantly, it makes sense from the client's positionality and also just what they're coming in with. That's sort of my short answer to that. Is really, I think, and I know that we were able just to briefly touch on the eco wellness factors, but to me, the more familiar you can become with those factors and like kind of and being able to I guess identify sort of through asking questions with your clients about what is relevant, I think that the better able you are to be able to decipher, like, this is what makes sense for this client in a collaborative sense.
Wonderful. And as you both said earlier, this is the beginning of some information to share with people. There's so much more that you can do and research yourself, and also reach out to our esteemed speakers here to see more about the work that they're doing. Thank you for answering that question.
Definitely. Actually, and Jolie, I was curious. So I don't know if they could go back to the slide for the contact information with us, but if that's possible, like I really want to encourage folks to reach out to us with questions, because I saw a couple of questions just around what's the research and sending stuff your way. And I have this book on eco wellness coming out in July. So like that's going to be a really good resource for bringing this into your theoretical approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. If we can take the slides back to the contact information for Dr. Sturm and Dr. Reese, that would be wonderful. Yes, it'd be great if folks can keep in touch with you all and continue on with this. And I know that ACES is doing a lot of work around this as well, and you all are partnering with them. So there is a lot to still know about. Also want to, there's a question that's come in about PARC too. So wondering if Brian could answer a question for us as well. Someone has written in asking, can you speak to how you plan to grow the PARC model and the work in the global space, and how you plan to do that through PARC?
Absolutely. The first thing I will say is NBCC has a phenomenal foundation that already focuses in this area. So we will partner with them. We already have had conversations in this space. And we have to keep in mind when we look at the federal government and agencies, there is a global approach already in place. Currently, there are 18 bills and actions by both Republicans and Democrats in this space. Some of them are focused on the nation, but some of them do expand worldwide. And we are going to stay a part of those conversations, monitor those conversations, and I assure you, counselor voices will be heard within those conversations. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. So much of what we're all talking about here is advocacy in one way or another. Very important for the profession, very important for our clients and the work that we're doing for clients. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for any more questions. So again, I want to thank all of our speakers, Dr. Sturm, Dr. Reese, and Brian. Thanks for sharing their knowledge, their expertise, and really their passion for the work that all of us are doing. And to all the participants that were able to join us for the webinar today, taking your time out of your day to join us. I know it's not easy, especially if you are seeing clients. So the link to the session evaluation is posted in the chat, and we will also email it to you. If you don't get it out of the chat, we'll email it to you following the meeting. To receive the continuing education credit, you must complete the evaluation, including the attendance attestation, by February 20th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Certificates are going to be emailed by February 27th for the continuing education. We will only be providing credit for the live attendance of this webinar. As you complete the evaluation, please feel free to share any topics that you would like to see us cover in our future webinar lineup. We hope you found this session informative. We look forward to seeing you again as we continue our webinar series. We thank you, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks.